Tristram McPherson, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, today we're going to talk about ethics, but ethics with a twist, because usually we often think about how to act right or wrong depending on individual action, like is it wrong for me to punch someone in the street? But we're going to look at a special case of how to act morally when we're confronted with global scale issues. In this case, I'm thinking, for example, at climate change or animal suffering or exploitations of humans in factories and so on. So how should we act morally? First, by zooming in at the individual actions.
Sure. So I want to start out maybe by offering a kind of lighthearted example to get us into the feel of kind of what's distinctive about the kinds of questions that you've just posed. So um, there's an excellent fantasy book from, I don't know, probably about 25 years ago now or a little more, called Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. And there's a bit in the book. The book is kind of a satire about the apocalypse. One of the main characters in the book is a demon, but he's a very modern demon. And, the old demons, they're going around and they're trying to cultivate relationships with individual people and slowly tempt them to, sell their soul to the devil. But Crowley, that's not the way he rolls. So one of the examples of one of the things he does is he very carefully messes with the highway design around London so that people are just in traffic jams all the time, right? And so the thought is he never convinces a single person, he never has a one-on-one conversation where he convinces that person to sell their soul to the devil, but he creates day after day, just thousands of people in this low level stress and frustration about traffic, which he says, if you want to do evil these days, you've got to do it at scale, right? And I think the kind of thing that Crowley is doing in that scenario, the sort of interesting thing about it, it doesn't have the kind of vivid sort of one-on-one interactive sort of feel of oh, I've convinced this one person to sell their soul to Satan, right? And in the same way, in your example, various of the things that we might do as consumers, for example, don't have the kind of visceral ethical sort of character to them that you might think that, if I punched you in the face, that would sort of clearly be beyond the pale in a sort of way. And I think that part of the sort of thing that's marvelous about the satire in that book, in that particular scene, is that part of the point that the authors are trying to make is that in a sort of contemporary, highly connected global world, you can do a lot more evil. And this was Crowley's point. You can do a lot more evil by messing with intersection design than you can if you're going up to people one by one and trying to do your evil with them, right? And so you might think in a similar way that some of the most profound ethical challenges that we face in the contemporary world are challenges which aren't caused by a single person doing a really terrible thing to another person. They're caused by almost everyone doing little things in their everyday life on a repetitive basis, right? So some examples of this are things like, all of the ethical harms that are going to happen to, all the suffering, all the death that's going to occur as a result of climate change. There's no one person who's pressing the climate change button. Each of us is doing our part to make climate change happen in a way that's going to have all of these terrible effects for people. And similarly, I think one of the great ethical horrors of our age is the factory farming, which involves horrifying suffering and death to billions upon billions of animals every year. And again, there's no one person who's masterminding that. And everyone who's eating animal products is in some way contributing, perhaps you might say, to the sustenance of that very horrific process. And so you have, as it were, a bunch of really terrible ethical results that are occurring in sort of the way Crowley imagines. It's all of these people sort of interacting within a structure in such a way that these bad results kind of predictably occur at scale. So I just want to pause there. Is that kind of a helpful kind of intro to the kind of question that we're asking?
Yes, so definitely, and I think, as I understand you, we have a responsibility to do something. Apparently, as you were saying, it's each of us that press the climate change button every day. So potentially, we should do something else, right?
Good. So this is at least is the question. So there are philosophers whose work I take very seriously, who think, no, when you really think about this question, maybe there's nothing. There's nothing that we just don't have obligations. We don't have reasons that arise out of these kinds of structures. It's like tragic. It's awful, but we have reasons to do things in other kinds of cases, and we don't have reasons in these kinds of cases. I have found that a hard conclusion to accept throughout most of my thinking about this topic for, I don't know, the past 20 years or so. My inclination has always been, it seems like when I think about myself and the way that I'm related to these bad outcomes, it seems like I do have some reasons to change my behavior in various ways. But then the philosophically gripping question, the question that has like kept me up at night for 20 years, is like, why? Like, what explains those reasons? And so one of the things that I hope we talk about today is just there are a lot of different interesting stories about what might explain the reasons that each of us have. And so I want to introduce you to some of those stories, and we can think about how good those stories are, how satisfied we are. Maybe at the end of the day, we throw up our hands and be like, none of those stories sound any good. Maybe we don't have reasons, right? Or maybe a more humble reaction is we haven't figured it out yet, which is, I'm a philosopher. Figuring things out is hard, but we can do our best to try to understand. So do you want to sort of direct me in a particular way, or I can just kind of jump in and start talking about a way that you might try to address this question?
Yeah, so I mean, the first one is really diving into the individual action. So as we were saying, like potentially we do something wrong. So we have at least some kind of reasons that we should act. But the issue, I mean, with climate change, it's exactly this issue is that we feel that our actions are a bit just a drop of water in this mess that we have. And so how do you see this? Do you see that those actions are still something that we should do just out of necessity? This is something that we need to try to fight because it's wrong? Or is that something that, as you were saying, we can clean our hands and say, hey, actually, it's a problem bigger than me?
Good. So I actually want to start by talking about the drop of water analogy that you offered. Because I think there's actually two different ways of thinking about that analogy. When I think they have very different it's important to think about them in very different ways. So here's one kind of problem. There are many, many people in the world who will suffer from malaria, and some of them will even die from malaria because they don't have access to just like bed nets that could protect them from malaria-infected mosquitoes while they sleep, right? And it turns out those bed nets are like very inexpensive to produce, and there are like reputable organizations like the Against Malaria Foundation, which like collects donations from people and uses that money to, like buy bed nets and distribute them to places where they're needed, where people can't afford to buy them themselves. Okay, so here's an observation. Suppose that I take $100 and I give it to the Against Malaria Foundation. One way of reacting to that is, well, that's just a drop in the bucket in the following way. It's not that like everyone will be saved from getting malaria when I give my $100. The problem is too big. Our resources, and especially my own resources, are too limited to solve the problem completely. On the other hand, it might still be the case that because I give the Against Malaria Foundation my $100, they're able to buy several hundred nets and distribute them to various people in their efficient network that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to do. And maybe a dozen people are spared from getting malaria because of my donation, right? So of course, there's a sense in which my action is a drop in the bucket, right? I have not solved the problem of people getting malaria in easily avoidable ways. But on the other hand, I've made a real difference. Like, say there's a dozen people who would have otherwise gotten malaria who, because of my action, they haven't. That's an enormous impact. Although in one way of thinking about it, it's a kind of a drop in the bucket, right? So one of the things that I think is a kind of mistake people sometimes make in their reasoning is they think about the collective nature of a problem, like, millions of people getting malaria, and they think, I can't solve that problem, and then they kind of throw up their hands. But I think that's not philosophically speaking, ethically speaking, I think that's not the hard problem. I think if you can make a difference, if you can save a bunch of people by making a donation to a reputable organization, then I think you do have pretty strong reasons to do that insofar as you have the means, et cetera, right? Here's the harder version of the drop in the bucket kind of case, which really has to do with the thought that my choice might not make any difference at all to the outcome. So here's the kind of picture that many people have. And I'm going to talk about a kind of case that gets talked about by many philosophers in this literature, starting definitely with Peter Singer, who's the grandparent of this whole literature, I think. So suppose that I think that the way that chickens are factory farmed in North America is horrifying and it's terribly wrong. And I am at the restaurant, and I'm trying to decide whether to order the chicken dinner, right? Well, here's something that you might think. My ordering the chicken dinner there is quite different from my sending the money to the Against Malaria Foundation in the scenario I imagined. Because many people think it's really, really, really not plausible that, like, how many chickens, Purdue or whoever it is, are going to program to get raised and slaughtered in their chicken factories is going to be affected at all by my decision of whether to order the chicken or whether to order some vegetarian meal, right? The market is just not that sensitive, right? Like, as some people will put it, there's just all of these buffers built into the system. Like, at the end of the day, maybe if I don't order the chicken, maybe it just gets thrown away, right? Or what have you, right? And so the thought would be there. It's like, no, it's not that I make a difference, but that difference is a drop in the bucket. I only save one chicken and there's so many billions of chickens, right? Rather, the problem is I haven't saved any chickens, right? So that's the kind of challenge. And there's a famous response to that challenge, which was offered first by Peter Singer and has been developed by several other philosophers in the interim. And the response goes like this. It's true that our markets are not perfectly responsive to consumer behavior. It would be bizarre if they were, right? But they are responsive to consumer behavior. There's some number of people choosing to order the vegetarian meal rather than buying the chicken, such that if they did that, the market would notice the demand and the price would change. And because the price changed, fewer people would have an incentive to raise their chickens under these factory farming conditions, right? So what follows from that? Well, Singer says, we don't know exactly where this threshold is. And we also don't know, like, where we are relative to that threshold. But he says, just to put some numbers to it, like, imagine that for like every 10,000 people who become vegetarian, like 10,000 fewer chickens are raised every year under these conditions. And now you don't know, like, if you turned out to be the 10,000th person, right? The person who hit that tipping point, right? They were gonna, like, but for that last person, they were going to like build that extra factory. But because you chose to order the vegetarian dinner, then you make this huge impact. The marginal impact of what you would have done would have been to, like, save, 10,000 chickens every year from this happening. But of course, your chances of being that person are very low, right? After all, you might be the second to last person, or you might be like the person in the middle of that sequence of 10,000 people, or what have you, right? And so what Singer says is, well, it is true that your chance of actually making a difference is very low. But if you're the person who makes a difference, the difference you make is huge. And so what Singer says is, when you multiply those two things through, you can kind of, the expected difference you make, and this is a piece of, like, philosophers' technical jargon, right? Or sometimes economists use similar kind of jargon, right? The expected difference you make is non-trivial. It's almost the same, Singer thinks, as if you really were. You can imagine the restaurant where, like, you order your chicken dinner months in advance and they raise that chicken, right? And like the thought is like, the expected outcome is pretty close to that, even though there is all this slack, et cetera. The actual outcome, most likely you don't make any difference. But if you do, you're going to make a huge difference. And so the kind of average over the long run kind of difference of everybody doing this is going to be pretty similar. That's roughly the kind of Singer picture.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, and now if you think that picture works, then we've kind of answered your drops in the bucket worry, right? Because what we said is now I said there were these two different kinds of cases and they were like really different, right? But now what it looks like is the second case looks a lot more like the first case. It's not the same because most likely you're not going to make any difference. But as it were, you're doing the kind of thing that has that has a small chance of making a huge difference. And having a small chance of making a huge difference can be as ethically important as having a large chance of making a small difference. That's kind of Singer's big idea in this context. So that's kind of the first proposal as a solution to this problem, is you do have a reason, for example, to not order the chicken dinner in this kind of case. Why do you have that reason? You have that reason because if you order the chicken dinner, you have a small chance of being the person who triggers the building of the new factory, right? Or to put it in more positive terms, if you refrain, you have a small chance of being the person who makes it the case that no factory is built, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Those are really big differences. And so small chance of a big difference gives you a significant reason to change your behavior. So that's kind of the sort of the Singer proposal, also, as it were.
And okay, so before we go further, let me just unpack it so that we're sure that we're on the same page. So basically, the first thing was that individual actions, sometimes they have an impact. The case of the malaria nets, that is something that we can think that there's like a causal link between I donate 100 francs and then those 12 people will be saved from suffering. So in this case, there was a direct impact, but there's also those other cases which are much more complicated to see where the impact really is. For example, recycling. If I decide to put my plastic bottle in the recycling, then it's not really clear what is the impact of it. It could be, maybe the climate change when we are like 3 degrees over the limit that we want that we should stay at will be delayed by a few milliseconds or something for this specific recycling action. And so for those ones, it's much more complicated to see if there is actually an impact or not. And then you transitioned and you said, well, maybe not individually, but collectively, we might be this person that in the case of animal farming, that will change the production, because they will see, once there is many people that participate or don't participate in eating chicken, then they will probably change and say, well, there's less demand, so let's reduce production. Right. The big challenge on this is a bit this mathematical calculation that Peter Singer does as a consequentialist. He since this probability is extremely low, because the more actors you have, the less your chance to actually be this one person that's going to have an impact. That means that as a consequence, then of course, like the utility, the overall utility that's going to be calculated will be extremely low as well, right? So what I see as a challenge is that it's kind of negligible as well. That's one response that we can give to Peter Singer. It will also be negligible, the actions when we do that. And then that opens up the question of, is that something that we should do, or should we actually do something else?
Good. So I just want to add a couple of comments, some of which are like complicating my own story and some of which are responding to some of the things that you said. So one thing I want to make clear is that in the malaria bed net example, I'm making some controversial assumptions. right? And I just want to flag that I haven't defended those assumptions. There's an interesting paper by philosophers Julianevsky and Sergio Tannenbaum, which actually they basically argue that like the malaria bed nets case is actually like the factory farming chickens case. It's not this sort of direct difference making kind of like just because of the structure of those aid institutions. And I don't want to pick that fight. The idea was I just want to sort of say, if things are like this, then here's a way of thinking about it, right? And in general, one of the things I want to say is like my skill set as a philosopher, very often the way that I'm going to reason is, if things are like this, here's how we can reason about it. And then somebody else is going to be much more expert to tell me like, is the world actually more like this? Is the world actually more like that, right? If somebody wants to tell me like, how much waste is there in grocery store supply chains, for example, when you're trying to think about, how much slack there is if you're trying to decide whether to buy a steak at the grocery store, like that's not my area of expertise, right? So so that's the first thing that I want to sort of say, and that's just by way of being modest about what I'm saying, even on behalf of someone like Singer, or even on behalf of like setting the problem up. The second thing I want to say, though, is I want to come a little bit to Singer's defense. So one of the things you were saying is like, well, like Singer is a utilitarian, and one reaction that you might have, and I think many people have this suspicion, that if you're not a utilitarian, you shouldn't find this reasoning as satisfying. So let me just say a little bit about what utilitarianism is in a very simplified way. So this is sort of one of these sort of big traditions in ethical theory. Very roughly, utilitarianism says we have a story about what makes an action right in every possible circumstance. What makes an action right is just the action that, of all the options available to the agent, is going to bring about the best outcomes. And not just the best immediate outcomes, but the best long-term outcomes, right? And that's what makes an action right. And that's a really powerful and interesting, but also very controversial theory. It has lots of unintuitive implications, and like, people write dissertations arguing for and against it all the time, right? Okay. So you might think, well, utilitarianism as a theory is really comfortable with this idea that we just care about utilities. We just care about which is going to make things a little bit better or a little bit worse. And like many people think, oh, there are other things in ethics that matter a lot. And one of the things I want to point out, I think, with respect to the range of questions that we're thinking about, things like factory farming and climate change and sweatshop labor and all these kinds of things, I don't think that you need to be a utilitarian to find Singer's reasoning plausible. And one of the reasons why, I just want to say a little bit about this. Mm-hmm. Consider climate change. I think this is maybe the clearest case. I think there's nothing intrinsically objectionable about the idea of my putting carbon or methane into the atmosphere, right? Why is that objectionable? If it's objectionable, it's objectionable because it contributes to warming, and then warming contributes to causing a bunch of bad effects. And so there are cases which don't seem like this in terms of our ordinary way of ethical thinking, right? If I tell a lie about you behind your back, it might be that no one is ever harmed. It might be like you never find out, your feelings are never hurt. The people who I lie to, they're just like, oh, that's Tristram talking again, right? But you might think, oh, I've still wronged you, right? I shouldn't be lying about you behind your back. That's not cool, right? And it seems like the fact that I've wronged you seems to have to do with something about the way that I've treated you and lying about you, and not about the effect of my action. At least many people sort of think this, right? And there's other examples like this. If I treat you paternalistically, if I'm like, yeah, this is your podcast, but I'm going to tell you exactly how to do it, and right, then they'd be like, wait, Kevin, you're an adult human being. I don't have the right to tell you how to do your job, right? But the point that I want to make is many of these problems, like the problem of climate change, they don't look like that. It doesn't look like the problem with putting climate into the atmosphere is oh man, I'm doing something mean to Kevin, or I'm failing to respect you or something, right? Rather, it seems like I'm contributing to this thing that's ultimately going to have bad effects. right? And so one thing to say about this set of problems is it really does look like these are problems, first of all, where we really should care about effects, and we should expect that our reasoning to go through effects, right? And this is part of, I have a paper about this called The Puzzle of Inefficacy, and I say this is part of what makes this class of problems distinctive, is exactly there are these cases where it seems like if we're going to have an explanation of the reasons that each of us have, they're going to have connect in the right way to the effects of our behaviors, in some way or other. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think many people have this thought that like, oh, a small risk of producing a really bad outcome, maybe that's not as bad as like certainly producing a smaller bad outcome. And I just want to push back on that a little bit, right? Now you might have some kind of discount that you want to apply, but it seems to me that like if I can perform an action that has like a 1 in a million chance of causing a nuclear bomb to detonate in an American city, like performing that action, even if, as a matter of fact, the 1 in a million chance doesn't come to fruition and no one is harmed, performing that action will be like one of the most heinous things I could do. If I did it knowingly, if I was like, whatever, I'll take the chance, I feel lucky, like it's not my job. It's not my job to like take risks for a whole city of American people, right? And so one of the things I kind of want to push back on is I think it would be a mistake to think, oh, well, the chances are really small, so it must be fine.
One
So
question just on that.
please go ahead.
Yeah, just one thing. I agree with you, but the thing is that there is a calculus that is brought when we talk about consequentialism, utilitarianism. And so this is where I agree with you. Usually that would be very tricky to click this button, 1 million chance, and then nuclear bombing. But the utilitarian would say, well, if the expected utility that comes out of it is lower than something else, then actually this is fine to do it. That removes a bit this moral weight. And I think that's what I meant in the example of the threshold. I find it interesting that utilitarians are using this example because if you put the calculus, then of course, if you have one side of the multiplication which is extremely small, then the expected utility will also be very, very small. In your case, I think you bring a bit more of another view of ethics to complement a bit this challenge from utilitarianism, right?
Yes. So I'm not myself a utilitarian. So let me just follow up on like one thread of what you just said, because I think like our audience might miss it, and I think you made like a really important point. And this is a point more about utilitarianism than I think about the kind of the heart of the problem that we're talking about, but I think it's worth making, right? One of the features of the standard form of utilitarianism is that many things that we ordinarily think of as wrong, when they have bad effects, even if they have bad effects, they can turn out to be right because there's some good effects that sort of balance things out, right? And so just to sort of make this vivid, suppose that if I order the chicken dinner, like, yeah, there's this risk of these bad effects, et cetera, right? But suppose that you say to me, Tristram, if tonight you order the chicken dinner and eat it, I will donate $100 to the Against Malaria Foundation. All these people will get bed nets. Otherwise, I won't, right? Well, then if I'm a good utilitarian, I should like run the calculus and think, oh man, right? The expected utility of my eating the chicken dinner by itself, of course, is negative. Like I'm going to enjoy the chicken maybe a little bit, maybe not. I haven't eaten chicken in a long time. Probably be pretty weird. But maybe like that, but like the expected effect on the chicken is like negative, et cetera, et cetera. But like at the same time, my option by doing that, you're going to donate this money. These people will be saved from malaria. That's all the suffering that will be averted. And utilitarianism seems to be a theory that says, well, in that case, eat the chicken, right? Because that's the thing that's going to bring about the net overall best outcome. And how have you managed to do that in your nefarious way, Kevin? By doing this thing that I was trying to suggest was a bad thing, right? Eating the chicken dinner with a really good outcome. You said, so another agent can just come around and be like, hey, let me change your utility profile by giving you an incentive in this way, right? And so some people think that's some people think that's an objection to utilitarianism. Don't let yourself get manipulated by people in that way. Like, that's not okay. So that's a really interesting debate about utilitarianism that I just want your audience to appreciate. The way I was thinking about the case, you don't need to buy that in order to buy the sort of Singer reasoning about this particular case, that we have some reasons not to order the chicken dinner because of the expected bad effects of doing so, right? And one way that you could try to resist that is you could say, resist the conclusion that when you make me the nasty offer, that changes what reasons I have, right? You could say, oh, like, there's this asymmetry between contributing to causing harm on the one hand and preventing harms on the other. And like, what you're doing is you're offering to prevent some harms if I cause some harms or something like that, right? So you might try to make some kind of move like that. And I just want to say it's complicated, right? But somebody might be able to say, no, I like the Singer style reasoning about this case, but I'm going to resist the idea that I can be manipulated by somebody who's going to like make me one of these weird offers, right? Okay, so I just want to spend maybe another minute or two talking about the Singer style strategy, because there's a response to the Singer style strategy, and I think, again, you actually in your comments about it sort of alluded to this a little bit, and I just I want to get to that. There's a response that has become quite popular, which is to say that if we actually, and this is the part that I'm not as expert on, right? If we actually understand how the world works, Singer's math doesn't work the way he thinks it does. And so the person I think who's written the best paper pursuing this line of thought is a philosopher named Mark Biddulphson. And he basically says, we should expect that actually your chance of being the person who is at that tipping point, really, 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 really low, relative to the size of the difference if you are the person at the tipping point. So what he wants to say is that, like, Singer is suggesting there's some kind of proportionality between the two things. Like, the less likely it is that you're the person at the tipping point, the bigger the impact if you are that person. And Biddulphson wants to say there's a bunch of things about the way that our food system is set up, such that actually these two things come apart, such that it's like orders of magnitude less likely that you're going to make a difference than the scale of the difference that you're going to make if you do. And so what that winds up meaning is that as it were, the expected effect on animal welfare, according to Biddulphson, if you refrain from eating the chicken dinner, is actually just vanishingly small. Like, there's maybe some tiny positive effect, but it's so small as to be sort of almost inconsequential, the kind of thing that we just generally shouldn't worry about. And so notice, and again, I want to sort of say, like, there's like my area of expertise, and there's other people who know things about, how various systems in the world work. I don't feel qualified to adjudicate that question. I think this is a deep, interesting question about food systems. I don't, it's complicated, and you might get different answers in different cases, right? And so what I want to say is, like, suppose the world is the way that Mark Biddulphson thinks it is, then we don't really have a good Singer-style story. Like, we only have a good Singer-style story about why I should refrain from eating the chicken in this case, if the world is, as it were, cooperative, if the world is responsive in the way Singer thinks it is, and not sort of unresponsive in the way that Biddulphson thinks it is. And so I think that's kind of an interesting result, because, and now I'll just sort of speak for myself. Remember, at the beginning, I was like, I'm kind of inclined to think that we do have these reasons. And I'm also inclined to think that we have these reasons even if it turns out the world is the way that Mark Biddulphson thinks it is, right? And so then the question is, well, like, how could that work? Right. And so then I think you need to start looking at different kinds of relations. And I can tell you about, I'm conscious of the time, but I'll just talk about a couple of other sort of strategies that I think are really interesting. So one thing that you mentioned in kind of discussing the Singer style strategy with me is that if I order the chicken, I'm a member of a group. the group of people who order chickens, right? I am a chicken consumer, right? And you might sort of say, oh, here's this group of people, the chicken consumers. And there's something that's uncontroversially true about that group. The group of chicken consumers, they together make a huge difference, right? If the group of chicken consumers, like everyone woke up tomorrow morning and was like, no more factory farm chicken, like all the factory farms would go bankrupt in the big scary corporations that actually exploit the people who run the factory farms. The whole food system is very disturbing, but like it would all go bankrupt, right? Because there would just be no consumer demand anymore, right? And so as a group, the group of chicken consumers really make a huge difference, right? And so one thing that you might think is, well, look, I don't like the story about my reasons isn't I have a reason not to order the chicken because I'm going to make a difference by not ordering the chicken, or I'm going to make an expected difference even if not an actual difference, Alice Singer. Rather, the answer is this: if I order the chicken, then I become a member of this group, the chicken consumers. And the chicken consumers collectively are responsible for like the suffering and like early death of like billions and billions and billions of chickens. That's like, and now like you have strong reasons to not be a part of a group that produces like ethical evil on such a vast scale, right? And so that's a second kind of structure. Like, don't do this, not because of the effects of your action, but because in doing it, you're going to be a part of a group. And that group is sort of uncontroversially doing bad things as a group. Like as a group, you're bringing about these terrible outcomes.
One thing about this is that I see a bit two different phases. So let's take the example of climate change. The first one, I think there is a bit of an epistemic problem because there is a certain cost of information, the same for animal suffering. Not everybody agrees that climate change is an issue, or, that animal suffering is an issue, or ordering on Temu or whatever it is. And so the first step is we kind of need to be informed in order to make a moral decision. And then the second step is, well, now I decided that it makes sense and I should do something. And then we're confronted with this negligibility of our reaction, the lack of impact, direct impact. So when we see it like this, assuming that actually, fair enough, we have a reason to act because collectively, if we all change our behavior, the thing would just stop. How far should we go in terms of informing ourselves? And are we also morally responsible of something that we ignore? Because potentially right now we're talking about those three challenges, but there is this huge thing that is just hidden somewhere that we all act immorally, but we don't know about it.
Absolutely. So I want to actually back up just a little bit and talk about, there's actually a controversy in ethical theory that your discussion touches on that's pretty important. So suppose that, unbeknownst to me, by going on your podcast, I'm going to make a horrible thing happen. Somebody watches the podcast and is like, I'll show that McPherson guy, and goes and like kills someone or something like that. That like, please, if you're watching the podcast, don't do that. This is a terrible example. There's a way in which like there's this bad outcome that's followed on from my behavior, but there's no way that I could know that that bad outcome was going to follow on from my behavior. And so what some people want to say is that when we're trying to think about which of my actions are right and which of my actions are wrong, we just think about like what actually happens. And so in the scenario that we were describing, these people are going to say, it was wrong of Tristram to go on this podcast because this terrible thing is going to happen when it happens. Of course, Tristram couldn't have known about that. We shouldn't blame him, right, etc. But like, still, I've performed this terrible wrongful action. Other people, and this is a tradition in ethical theory which goes back at least as far as John Stuart Mill, think, no. Whether it's wrong for me to perform the action depends in part on like what my information was. And like, given my information, it couldn't be wrong for me to have performed this action because there's no way that I could have known. And like, it was of course regrettable what I did, and like in retrospect I should say things like, oh, if only I'd known, I wouldn't have done, I wouldn't have done this thing. But so I just want to point out there's like a sort of background controversy in ethical theory about like when you act in a way that has terrible outcomes, but you couldn't have known about it, like have you acted wrongly? And people actually go both ways on that. So there's a big debate about that. Okay, but you actually asked this other really important question, which is, given that sometimes there are things that we don't know that are going to cause us to perform actions that are problematic, that are morally wrong in the sort of one sense, right? Or that are regrettable, at least in the other sense, how much of an obligation do we have to educate ourselves about those things? So unfortunately, I don't think there's like a one-size-fits-all answer to this question. I think that we all have some strong reasons to be informing ourselves about the world around us and about the kinds of effects that our actions can have. And not just our own behaviors, but like connected up to this whole set of problems that we're talking about today, right? What are the effects of groups that I'm a member of, or kind of patterns that I'm helping to instantiate, et cetera, right? So I think, for example, that like it would be good if a lot more people in North America knew about like the way factory farming works, right? I think that would be really excellent. And I think that that information is not that hard to come by. And I think that, for many people, they probably have reasons to be educating themselves about these things. But on the other hand, I'm also like conscious of the fact individual people are in very different kinds of situations. For some people, that information is like right there, and it's easy for them to get the information in a way that they can see that the source they're getting the information from is trustworthy, et cetera. For other people, they have misleading evidence about like whether there's anything to be learned there. They have like other kinds of pressing obligations in their life and their time, right? So I think it's going to be hard to have an answer that's the same for everybody, because I think some people have really good excuses for not knowing this stuff, and other people really should know better, and they should have taken the steps to make it the case that they do know better, right? So that's a bit of a wishy-washy answer to that question, because I sort of feel like for some people, like, yeah, really, we should know more than we did. And there are steps that you can take to inform yourself, and you can, if you're bored on a Saturday afternoon and you want to think like, what are the important things that I should be knowing about the world that are ethically important that I don't currently know about? Like, there are ways of getting that information, right? There are people who are interested in exactly those kinds of questions, right? And so, so that's my general slogan is like, yes, we have reasons to inform ourselves, like ethical reasons to inform ourselves so that we can make better choices ourselves, be better citizens, et cetera. But I also think like it's tricky how weighty those obligations are and who they fall on, just because of the very different circumstances different people fall on.
Yep. And now, so I'm gonna crank it up for you. You already went far in this answer to give some reasons why we should act in a certain way. And what we discussed before was basically, in the end, maybe we're accomplice when we participate in a certain structure. For example, you go to eat chicken, you participate in the animal suffering, so that gives you reason not to do it. Now, my challenge to you is, what about some necessary harms? And I would like to think about it like, let's say that we take 1,000 animals and we torture them in the worst condition for like 2 years, very intense. And after that, we are certain, we know that torture will actually cure cancer. We're going to find a remedy for cancer, So in those cases, is that something that we should then see a bit like the how do you say, the impact of the suffering that brings this good? Or is it something that we should a bit see it as a deontological way of like, or as a rule of saying like, oh, just participating, being accomplice is too much. We shouldn't do it.
All right. So, let me say a couple of different things about this kind of case. So I want to say start out, I want to say I'm going to kind of ultimately try to give a kind of straight answer to this case that accepts all of your assumptions about the case. But I do want to start out by saying, and that's like, I'm a philosopher, this is the way that we operate often. But I do think that for the purposes of reasoning about the world, one thing that I think is very important is that very often people will sort of describe cases as if we're in that kind of scenario. And often that is a motivated and very misleading description of how things are, right? So just one thing that's very artificial about your case that I want to point out is like, it's almost unimaginable how someone could be in a situation where they knew beforehand that if they torture these 2,000 animals for 2 years, they're going to find a cure for cancer. But on the other hand, they don't already have the cure for cancer. Right? Like that combination, right? What don't you know that you're going to learn by doing this, but that you know that you're going to learn it, right? It's a very strange case. But so I'm just like pointing out, when we're reasoning about the world, one of the things, sometimes it's sort of troubling to think about certain kinds of cases exactly because they invite us to take seriously possibilities that we should really be questioning, like we should be questioning the setup. So I just want to like offer that to your audience as like, ask those questions when people are giving you cases sometimes, right?
Yeah. And
but now I want to, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, as a disclaimer, I wanted to say that I use it as a philosophical thought experiment, but I agree that seeing this in a practical case can seem totally different than just like a thought experiment. So
right, good. Okay, so then I want to say one other like throat clearing thing, right? Which is that I actually think what I say about this kind of case, I think, is again a little bit orthogonal to the main thing that we've been talking about today. That is, I could give either main kind of answer to this kind of case, and the rest of the things that I am saying, I think would still sort of work in roughly the same way. So I just want to sort of flag the kind of independence of this issue, but it's still a really interesting kind of issue, right? And the core of the issue is how we should feel about cases where you're inflicting suffering in order to bring about really good outcomes, right? And again, I talked about a fantasy novel at the beginning of the podcast, right? There's an extremely famous short story by Ursula Le Guin called "The Ones Who Walked Away from Omelas," and the premise of this story is that there's a community which for some reason, possibly having to do with some kind of magic, it's like not really clear how exactly this works, but for some reason, there's just some randomly chosen children who just have to like get tortured all the time, and then everybody else basically lives in utopia, right? So this is like the really extreme, stark version of the thought experiment, right? And the story is called "The Ones Who Walked Away from Omelas" because what Le Guin wants us to think about is she wants to think like there are certain kinds of ethical costs that no one should be willing to bear, even for the best possible outcomes, right? Like so that the community is free of disease and and all these good things about it, like none of that could make it okay to like inflict suffering on children in this way, right? So that's like the one perspective. That's the Ursula Le Guin perspective, right? And then the other perspective, which is the perspective again, right? We have our utilitarians, and what they're going to say is well, like, look, I mean, obviously, it's horrifying and tragic that these children are suffering, or in your scenario, that all of these animals are being tortured, like that. Like the utilitarians, like more than anyone else, are like, yeah, you like suffering. It's really bad. We should be trying to avoid it as much as possible. But what they're going to say is like, there's nothing special about their suffering, right? There's also the suffering of all the people who will get cancer. A close friend of mine just died of cancer like a couple of weeks ago, right? It was awful, right? And like the utilitarian is going to say, if you're genuinely presented with your choice, right? Then what we're really saying is, who do we want to suffer? Do we want these whatever it was, 2,000 animals to suffer for 2 years? Or do we want all the people who are going to get cancer, for however long it's going to take until some other option allows us to cure the relevant cancers, to suffer all the ways? And then they're just going to say, which of those is worse? And they're going to say, we want to be like completely fair to people, right? We don't want to say this person's suffering matters more than this person's suffering, right? And so that's what the utilitarian is going to say, right? The important kind of response to this that I think is the most powerful kind of response is to say there's a difference between foreseeing that someone is going to suffer a lot from cancer on the one hand, and like actively causing someone to suffer by, for example, actively torturing them on the other, right? And so the many non-consequentialists, and this is again, I take it where what Ursula Le Guin is thinking, right, are going to say like, no, like it's not just that you're weighing up these two bad outcomes and seeing which is worse. You're related in a different way to them. In the one case, you're like letting the bad outcome happen. In the other case, your hands are dirty. You are making the bad outcome happen, right? And this is again connected up to my little thought experiment at the beginning, where like you say, oh, like I'll donate this money to this charity if you like eat these chickens, right? Like there's a way in which if I say yes to that deal, which given the right setup of the scenario, the utilitarian says I should say yes, right? If I say yes to that deal, basically what I'm saying is like, I'm willing to do a little bit of contributing to harm in order that a better outcome can arise. And this is, I think, one of the deepest controversies in ethics. Some people really just, with the utilitarians stare at this and they're like, well, at the end of the day, what matters are these outcomes. And we just want to bring about as good of an outcome as we can. And other people think, no, there's just some things that you must not do, right? And I confess, I do not have the most satisfying view about this. I'm not just going to like stamp my foot. My view is a kind of boring view, which says almost all the time, the Ursula Le Guins of the world are right. But if you make the costs and the benefits extreme enough, then the utilitarians are right. If like somebody tells me like you need to like go home and cut off one of your children's fingers, right? That would be awful. But like if you don't do that, someone's going to drop a nuclear bomb on a big city, and I know that's all true, and I can trust the person, et cetera, right? Like it seems to me that I should cut off my child's finger. I mean, that's awful. Like it would, I'm not sure actually physically I could do it, but I think that's the thing I should do. Just because the relationship between the cost, which is awful, and I'm inflicting harm on my child, et cetera, but the harm being avoided is so much bigger that it seems to me that in that case we should do it. I just think the question then becomes like, well, where are the cutoffs? And I think nobody knows.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because I mean you have then you see it a bit of as an hybrid between utilitarianism and deontology. There is some things that we should not do. It's a rule. It's a moral, realist view of there is something that we shouldn't do, and then there is the other things that we should weigh the pro and the cons, depending on this. And then that's also one thing that I wonder, maybe more generally now in the ethical sphere. It seems that, I mean, you're a professor of ethics, and it's even hard for you to try to find a bit what is right, what is wrong. There's so many cases where it's complicated. Is that something that we can expect from people to act morally when there's all these challenges? We talked about the epistemic challenge. We need to be informed. There is the challenges of, okay, there's these different ways to look at ethics. How are we supposed then to make good decisions?
Okay, so I want to say several things about this. So first of all, I think, again, as with your question about like, how much of an obligation do people have to be informing themselves? I think we can expect different things of different people, right? I think if somebody has been like, there are people in the world who have gotten no love in their whole lives, and like they have been like suffering and struggling through their whole lives. And I think somebody who's like whose whole experience of life is like that, we can't expect very much of that person, right? Like that person may be incapable of seeing another human being like as a human being, right? Just because like what they've experienced has been so awful. On the other hand, I think there are many people that we can expect a lot of, right? I certainly expect a lot of myself, and I regularly fall short of my own expectations. But that's some of the work of being a person, I think. And so I think it's going to vary from person to person. I'm inclined to think one thing about human culture in general, and maybe a particular cultural moment now in particular, is that we are really quick to judge other people. And when we see other people performing actions that we think are not okay, and maybe even that, we're right about that, we're very often inclined to think, oh, well, that's a bad person, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's very complicated. People perform actions that are deeply regrettable for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes they do it out of ignorance. Sometimes they do it because they don't have the right kind of control over their emotions. Sometimes they do it because, they believe there's some greater good that's at stake, and they don't understand in a proper way the relationship between these things, right? So I think there's like lots of interesting kinds of explanations like that. And I guess what I'm interested in thinking is like, yeah, there are things that I think in ethics it's extremely hard to know. Like the thing I was just talking about, like where is the threshold where this harm is okay to inflict in order to avoid this catastrophic outcome? I think those questions extremely hard, but they're also incredibly easy questions in ethics, and I think we shouldn't forget that, right? Like, it's an extremely easy question to ask, like, should I assault the next person I see today? No, I should not, right? Should I be thinking about how to address problems like climate change? I think, yes, I should, right? And so I think that one thing that can happen, and especially professionally, philosophers focus on where the debates are and where the controversies are. And so if you think about ethics and you talk to philosophers, all you see are like, oh, there's smart people and they disagree about everything, and like, but we don't actually disagree about everything. But it's not interesting to sit down with a philosopher and just like, let's talk about all the things we agree about, right? Like I could have that conversation, but like I wouldn't teach an intro ethics class that way, because like the students would just be like bored. It's like, yes, okay, like, babies, we should give them lots of attention and love and resources and make sure that they have like a strong start in life. Like, all right, let's see like what arguments we can come up with for that. Like there's 1,000 different converging arguments. Like that would be like, that's, you could do that, but nobody teaches an ethics class that way. And I think no one teaches an ethics class that way because the feel is like, that isn't the thing that's like stretching our cognitive capacities to think about these issues. And I think what we're trying to do as philosophers is learn how to think better about the hard cases. But I think doing that could obscure the fact that I think there's actually a lot of cases where we are able to figure out the answers to these things.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I think it's a good place to land the plane. Right. So we know now that there's a lot to learn in ethics, and there's still a lot of open questions, but there is progress made every day by professors like you in the universities.
Hopefully. Sometimes, like on my best days, I hope it's like, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But sometimes I worry it's the other way around. So.
Exactly. Well, let's hope that we made some progress in this discussion and that people got something out of it.
All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for this really stimulating conversation. And I hope your audience enjoys it.
Thank you very much.